an assumption that tackling the political elite and the leadership in Iran would be enough to create a self-destruction within Iran, given the indication in previous months and years that there is a strong opposition, a strong protest movement on the ground, a strong exiled opposition in a diaspora that indicates strong signs of a potential replacement of the current regime in Iran. I think the Israelis are very well aware of the different components, the different power structures and agencies within the Islamic Republic, whether that's the religious establishment in Qom, the presidency in Tehran, or the IRGC within and beyond the Iranian borders. The assumption from Trump's administration's perspective may be slightly different from the Israeli perspective. As we previously discussed, the Israelis are interested in a continuous destruction of the Iranian regime, even if it meant that this war might temporarily end, but that it might continue in a few years following years of much more drastic sanctions.
Ultimately, if the Israeli government and the revolution survives this, they've in effect won, have they not?
It depends on the status quo, economically and politically. One could say the same thing towards Saddam Hussein's regime's survival from the Desert Storm operation in 1991. Would that be considered a victory? It wouldn't be, given that the sanctions, the drastic economic sanctions and the destruction of the infrastructure in Iraq between 1991 and 2003 was a massive sign of a flaw and a destruction within Saddam's regime at the time. There's a lot of assumptions and observations that might be the path for the Islamic regime in Iran in the next few years, if it were to survive this war, given that its survival mode would be much more detrimental and much more difficult in the following years, because the destruction and the attacks within the infrastructure, the civilian infrastructure and the natural resources and the political explosion has indicated that Iran will certainly be weaker in the future.
Well, absolutely. And in fact, going into this conflict, Iran was really fighting for its economic life.
Economic life, political life, existential threat within and beyond its border. Its existential proxy network threat across the region has been going through a massive threat given October 7, following the assassination of Hezbollah's chairman, following the downfall of Syria's Assad regime, which was seen as a massive Iranian standpoint in the region through its array of axis of resistance alliances, the decrease of the influences of many of the Iran-aligned groups in Iraq as well, and the strong opposition they have been receiving from Iraqi political opinion, public opinion and political discourse are all signs of a decreasing regional influence of Iran. This war in particular has been a direct target to the Iranian domestic, a direct target to the status quo of the Iranian regime in Tehran. Now, one might not deny that the continuous survival of the Iranian regime until today might come as a surprise, given the military and the political capabilities of both the US and Israel, but only time and the next few days will tell us to what extent will they be continuing the survival.
I just knew we're going to get to Ramallah. Nida Ibrahim,
a Middle East politics lecturer at Georgetown University in Qatar. He's with me now in the studio. I mean, there's so much to discuss. It's difficult to know where to start. Let's begin with the targeted killing of senior Iranian officials. If Israel is eliminating figures who might plausibly negotiate an end to this conflict, does that suggest that diplomacy is no longer part of the strategy here, or was diplomacy never part of it in the first place?
Oh, certainly diplomacy was never part of it from the first place, given that the strikes from the first day and the assassination of the supreme leader happened during the presumed talks, which most of the regional actors witnessed that it was signified in a way that would be progress and a sign of a good progress between both sides, whether US and Israel and Iran. So diplomacy is definitely being eliminated from the picture, which is why the Gulf states is finding this as one of the most challenging times in their contemporary history, given that they heavily relied on advocating for diplomacy to be at the forefront of any crises or potential crises to erupt between Iran and the United States, given that, as we see, the consequences of being the middle region between such a conflict erupting.
It begs the question, though, how aligned Washington and Israel are strategically at this stage. Are they pursuing the same strategic objective here?
They're certainly pursuing very different strategic objectives. We have to also ensure that the US strategy here is very narrowed down and limited to Trump's strategy, and we're witnessing that there is a lot of U.S. political divisions when it comes to this war, not just from the Democratic aspect, but also from the Republicans aspect. Many are questioning the legitimacy of the war and the preparedness of the war, noticing that it is purely an Israeli strategy, an Israel-oriented interest for having this war from the first place. The U.S. has lost major trust from its regional allies economically and politically. It seems like the U.S. is interested in a minor regime change, which was very evident from the rhetoric presented by President Trump as he was proposing some form of negotiations or acceptance in naming other people and rejecting other people, such as Mujtaba Khamenei. In Israel's case, it is very evident that they're much more interested in dismantling, creating a state destruction within the Islamic Republic, and also ensuring that such a destruction would also translate into a regional chaos.
With Israel now fighting on several fronts, not only is it targeting Iran, but Hezbollah in southern Lebanon are now expanding strikes into Beirut with mass displacement and high civilian casualties. I mean, can Israel do all of this all at once?
Well, since October 7, 2023, we've noticed that Israel has been rationalizing that political development into justifying its existential threat across the region by presenting an existential threat directly to different regional fronts. It does come as a surprise that after Israel pushing the U.S. into this war with Iran, that it decided to further enhance its already existing front with Hezbollah in Lebanon, but it also further indicates and reassures the idea and the notion that Israel is taking an advantage of the escalation of this regional war for its own expansionist agendas.
But does the scale of the displacement that we're seeing currently in Lebanon risk opening a second major front that could reshape the war and stretch Israel too far?
Absolutely, indeed. However, we have to also keep in mind that Hezbollah is also struggling with having a similar domestic support nationally and socially speaking against the Israeli aggression as it used to have in 2006. Hezbollah has also lost a strong regional social empathy since its involvement in the Syrian civil war, and it certainly has lost a strong political consensus about its future with the new Lebanese political elite, which makes it much harder to convince public opinion and political elites in Lebanon about the rationale of its war in Lebanon. However, if Israel continues the level of its military aggression against Lebanon, similarly to what it did in Iran, it may indicate some form of social empathy towards whomever is fighting Israel across the border as a response to the humanitarian crisis that is happening in both countries.
Good to talk to you, Zeidon. Many thanks indeed for your insight. He's a Middle East politics lecturer at Georgetown University in Qatar. He's with me now in the studio, picking up on what Zain was saying there about Gulf states, talking about an off-ramp, a diplomatic solution. Is there an off-ramp available? And to what extent are Gulf states key to ending this conflict?
Well, it's also an existential threat to the GCC economically and politically. The GCC is also aware that it has a strong political and economic leverage at stake here, given that this is also translating into an enormous global economic crisis. In fact, the economic crisis in the EU is presumed to be much more drastic and significant than it would be here, which is why they also believe that this could indirectly or directly translate into European efforts into pushing the United States to find a different solution to this war, or at least a different solution that would end the economic crisis across the globe.
What's going on behind the scenes right now? Who's talking to who? Will there be lines of diplomatic communication be open between, at the very least, between Gulf states and Iran, perhaps even Iran and the United States right now?
Well, there's two forms of channels of communication going on. There's the already existing ones, and then there's established new ones. The already existing ones, as we knew, are the Qatari efforts for many years in ensuring that there would be talks and reconciliation efforts, whether that's between the United States and Iran. Similar takes are being conducted by the Omanis, similar positions across the spectrum as well. But also in recent years, we've noticed strong reconciliation efforts between UAE and Iran, Saudi Arabia and Iran, particularly during the Baghdad summit between 2020 and 2021. Some of them got a bit paused due to the political developments that happened in the region, and some of them have been reactivated. Now, despite that, many of these Iranian attacks and missiles are attacking the national security of many of these GCC countries. Many of them are still trying to put so much commitment and effort into ensuring that dialogue and diplomacy is still at the forefront of the solution here, including the Saudis.
How does this end? I know it's impossible to speculate, but using your expertise, at least give us a range of possibilities as to how this can't go on forever. That's certainly not the hot phase of the war as now. Maybe the economic repercussions will go on for a while. But how does it end, do you think? What's the most likely scenario?
Well, in the short term, the likely scenario, as we can see it now, is that it's very heated, which is why the predictions makes it very difficult, given that both sides are claiming that they will continue this conflict until victory. From the Iranian perspective, survival is seen to be enough for the Iranian regime, given that they are being attacked by Israel, but also attacked by the most powerful and militarized global superpower, which is the United States. From the United States perspective, they're put in a position where they're trying to also defend their military and political reputation in the region, but also globally, given that if the United States leave this conflict without a symbolic achievement such as the assassination of Khamenei since day one, it might be seen that they have been withdrawing and not been able to push the Iranian regime to a complete surrender, as per the words of the United States president.
And what about Iran's strategy, if you like? You said survival. It's not just that, though, is it? It's deterrence, it's escalation management, it's an attempt to raise the cost of the war globally to achieve its objective, which is survival.
Absolutely. And in addition to all of these things that you mentioned, it's also trying to drag its existential element and status in connection to its regional allies, knowing that the GCC provides most of the natural resources to the rest of the world, and what that would translate to a global economic crisis, which is why many of these attacks come as a surprise to many political observers, directly attacking the national security, including civilian infrastructure in the GCC states, given that the war is only, or the strikes are only being conducted from the Israeli and the US side. But there is a very clear strategy in trying to ensure that rationalizing the idea that a war against Iran would translate into a regional chaos.
Good to talk to you again, Zeidon. Many thanks indeed, Zeidon Alkinani, for your insight.
In the studio today is Zeidon Alkinani. He's a Middle East politics lecturer at Georgetown University right here in Qatar. Thank you so much for joining us, Zeidon. So we've got this meeting taking place in Riyadh later. They're going to be discussing, the GCC is going to be discussing security challenges. Of course, there are many here. What do you think will be the kind of, I suppose, communique at the end of it? Will it be something anodyne, or do you think something concrete can come out of it?
Well, given the existential crisis and the threat they have been witnessing for the past few days, one major improvement or element one have noticed for the past few days is that the GCC have left a lot of their differences in many different scenarios in the region, most notably between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, given that they've noticed that the similarities and the commonalities between them are much stronger than their differences, given the example of how the current war has impacted all of them equally. There's been a lot of talks between different members of the political elites, publicly as well, throughout the media, discussing a potential security agreement and an alliance where there would be a unified coordination to ensure the importance of acknowledging the homogeneity of that national security.
So it's an unintended consequence, and perhaps even a strategic mistake on the behalf of Tehran, to actually provide this as a unifying thing for the GCC.
Of course, even looking at the GCC as part of an overarching umbrella of the US interest in the region has also been disastrous to Iran and its potential future relationships with its GCC neighbors. So from the GCC perspective, they've noticed several alarming issues that need to be addressed, a stronger collectivity in terms of security issues, a stronger economic preparations for such scenarios, and a stronger unified foreign policy, whether its approach towards Iran in the future or in ensuring a common standpoint in the future relationships between the GCC and the United States, given the major disappointment in dragging the GCC to be in the middle of this war without even consulting many of these GCC states.
But they had to, in a way, the Iranians choke off the Strait of Hormuz. It was a strategic imperative, was it not, in a conflict like this?
Absolutely. They've used it as a political and an economic leverage. They're viewing the Strait of Hormuz as a place that is completely owned by the Iranian government, and it might be so, but ignoring all of the international trade agreements, which translated and reflected into the economic crises we're witnessing today, and which is also perhaps why President Trump is trying, in response to control the Kharg Island, where 90% of Iran's oil goes through and comes out from, as a way to perhaps negotiate in the future about the Strait of Hormuz.
Zeidon, Ali Larijani's death, you could argue he was the most powerful man in the Iranian system of government here. What does it mean for Iran itself? What does it mean for the conflict?
It's a major sign of weakness from the Iranian regime side. It's a strong political leverage where the US and Israel can certainly claim that it's a symbolic achievement in the conflict. However, it's not the most notable assassination since the conflict took place. We can't deny that the supreme leader himself, Ali Khamenei, was assassinated, and which is the reason why this conflict has led to the way it is today. One cannot forget that the Iranian regime is not perhaps fighting a war where it's trying to undermine US influence in the region, but fighting a war where it's trying to survive in the face of US and Israeli strikes. However, the unfortunate element that we're witnessing here is that countries that are not heavily or even directly involved in this conflict have been involved in the overarching consequences here.
Zeidon, give us a sense of whether the timing was important here of his assassination. And I say that given that there were a lot of reports of some back-channel chats taking place from Larijani's office, etc., with Israel and the United States in order to perhaps negotiate a de-escalation at least here. And then the Israelis went ahead anyway and killed him. So, give us a sense of what you may make of that and what you can read from that.
Of course. Well, to counter our previous point of view, Larijani's assassination today, in the status quo of the conflict as it is today, is very detrimental for both sides, given that Larijani presented or was representing a point of view that was overarchingly or gradually seen as a collectivized opinion across the spectrum, as we're noticing a variety of different opinions across the political spectrum in Iran, whether that's the IRGC or the religious establishment or the government itself, as we notice these different political camps. But these continuous assassinations, as were previously discussed, just indicates that the US and the Israeli strategy is a complete war-oriented strategy towards the Iranian regime, without putting in any considerations into if Larijani may have been a better candidate to deal with than the potential candidates that will be coming into the picture today, which are most probably more associated with the IRGC.
Jason, thank you very much indeed. Politics lecturer at Georgetown University right here in Qatar. What does this really tell us, again, after, of course, 24 hours ago, the killing of Ali Larijani, arguably the most powerful person in the regime since the killing of the supreme leader and the head of the Basik forces as well, Gholam Reza Soleimani?
It's a complete challenge against the existence of the Iranian regime by completely eliminating whatever political elite or class that is at the forefront of this war, obviously without differentiating between who would be considered from the reformist camp and who would be considered from the traditional
That was going
camp.
to be my question, actually, yeah.
Yeah, there was also previous political observations whether even the US is considering whether they would differentiate between the different political camps within Iran's political elite. But there is a clear indication that there is a direct targeting of the complete existence of the Iranian regime. There is a complete, clear strategy in continuing this war. However, we're lacking what the plan B would be in the case of the fall of this Iranian regime. And based on what notions do they believe that this regime...
Is there a plan B? That's the thing.
There wasn't a plan B since the beginning, and it was very obvious given the fact that the assassination of the supreme leader happened from day one which perhaps takes us back to the assumption that both the US and Israel presumed, particularly Trump's administration, that this may be enough to end the Iranian regime in a similar way to how the toppling of Maduro allowed a complete US control of Venezuela economically and politically.
OK, let's get you to Ramallah, Nida Ibrahim.